Yeah, we're all here. Okay, so we have some time for the concluding discussion, which, at least for us, is a really crucial part of this event, and meant to really bring 3 very different panels, and 10, if we include, of course, yesterday's talk, 10 very different lectures. And in a way, at least what this event has been, in my mind, during the time that we had spent organizing it, was that there is a kind of a meta question hovering above this occasion, which is whether the self, the human self, really is entirely socially constructed, or whether the fact that we are, at the end of the day, all members of the same species means that certain internal experiences are universal, and what that question means for us as historians. And I would like to bring that up as a sort of very tentative way of approaching the concluding discussion, and see whether it still seems relevant at the end of this day or day and a half. I'm not entirely sure. I was greatly, I have to say, influenced by the East Asian panel, and specifically by South Asian, sorry, and Maria, again, you know, the Western ignorance. Maria's remark about social freedom versus psychological or mental freedom really struck me as important as a historian who writes or thinks or teaches American slavery. And whether the condition of enslavement, which I work on, is social enslavement and is experienced by men and women who live in a Western context. And when I say Western context, I also include Africa in some ways. Or at least that's how your presentation actually made me think. Anyway, so I'm not sure that that I've reached the end of this conference in the same mindset that I had started it, which is, I guess, exactly the point. So that's my very brief take, and I would be very interested in hearing what other people had to say about this question of the self as entirely socially constructed, and how is that useful to us.
Okay, so we each have one question that we want to pose, and then we'll open it for discussion. So my question is a bit in the same vein, but I want to make a distinction between to propose a distinction between a core self and a transformed or changing or moving self. And in the sense that often, for instance, resistance is diagnostic of power. Right? We don't always see power. We see it when we notice resistance. And in the same way, a lot of our accounts here seem to acknowledge the self or mark episodes of self-awareness when we have a self that is contested, changing, evolving, transformed. And I want to ask whether this quality is something of the self or intrinsically, or something of our research, that we are drawn to these bound to these borders, to the places where we mark a change, and therefore we can conceptualize it and present it, and we have something to work with. So that would be my take.
I am, in a sense, it relates to Yael's question. I'm interested in what does it all tell us about 21st century selves, and this also kind of brings us back to the talk that opened this workshop. What do we take from the radically different experiences of the self that we could explore, that we explored here, to think about, quote-unquote, the selfie period? How is, for example, the performance of self in past times different from or similar to, for example, the way we continuously 24/7 perform, whoever does perform on social media? And I think this may be far more important for people who are growing into this, as opposed to us who kind of absorb this relatively late in our lives. So, for example, for people for whom Facebook is natural, almost transparent, and who are constantly broadcasting who they are, day and night, what does it do to the way they experience themselves, understand themselves? Is there any way, a way of thinking about outside and inside in this environment? And again, what do we learn from the experiences of self that we encountered over the last day? So this is for us to discuss, and obviously any question that you want to add.
Feel free.
Yeah.
I think the same thing for a while. I think part of the project that Ray and I are working on concerns actually the distinction between using terms like the social self as analytic distinctions applicable to particular kinds of ideas, on the one hand, and structuring human reality between an inner and an outer, or psychological and social and so forth, because the latter is really the result of a very particular trajectory of Western modernity. You don't find it in the Stoics, you don't find it in the Western classical tradition, you don't find it in India. Which is not that there are these analytic distinctions lacking, but rather that we're ground up when we ask how words that are lexically translatable into words such as self, so, person, so on. When they are talked about in these materials, I think they make us challenge the very idea that there is a ground up, metaphysically given, conceptually evident inner-outer distinction. Rather, it is that, depending on the context, we are going to find different ways of approaching what we take ourselves to be. That might, for example, be in one kind of intellectual tradition within India, a discussion over whether there is a core self or not. But there are other places where sort of phenomenological exploration of what it is to be human traverse exactly those kind of distinctions that, in modern terminology, we have taken for granted as being the terms within which we work. So that, for example, talking about the social in terms of the women being once being married, once being mothers and daughters and so forth, is not, therefore, with, as far as I can make out in many of these Indian materials, to do with some kind of an inner psychological self, but rather with a different conception of relationality, in this case, perhaps the spiritual. So I think what these kinds of materials point out. And actually, I thought Alice's thing about Africa was saying the same thing, that we start from somewhere else. The very ways in which we deploy the concept of self seem to ask us to challenge the self-evident nature of modern Western discourse, and ask us to look at these other sources and say, can we understand who we are now in the 21st century in radically decentered ways? This is a time of a semi-digested Western modernity. To globalize this, we need to ask, how can we talk about, for example, digital selves through a Buddhist discourse, for example, which is always talking about ground up, fleetingness, momentariness, as endless reflections of phenomenological selfhood that is given in the moment and passes away. That will make us think about what is the nature of the postmodern digital condition in quite a radically different way than if you're thinking of this as a post-Cartesian response to a pre-givenness which is now being undermined. It always seemed that way from other perspectives. I think that would be the kind of ways we need to ask ourselves how we even articulate the question of the self needs to open itself up to these multiple cultural sources.
I wanted briefly to comment on you and also, of course, to add well on that side of the discussion, because if you remember this morning, when I said they are slaves, but not in the sense of the 19th century. I was precise at this point. Because in my research experience, I came onto different situations. For instance, you have a term which is state through history, always the same native terms, which goes since the 17th century up to today. But the meanings behind the word are changing continuously. So when you discuss with the native term, you have to be sensitive that the meanings are changing time. And on the opposite, you have the same situation repeating itself, but coming under different names. So like you have the same type, for instance, of behavioral performance, even the slave as a performance, for instance, in this part of Africa, it's specific also body performance, which repeats itself, but people use different names. So you have continuity in the discontinuity of naming, and discontinuity in the continuity of the name. So as anthropologists, we are always fighting, with this sort of trying to dialogue with this. And when you come to the subject, I think as an anthropologist, the first question is how can I translate it? Can I even translate this word to start a conversation with people? Because, for instance, in these languages spoken in this area, you don't really say I, you say I say, call, me. I'm the one who can talk, which is a different topic. I'm not one, I'm the one who talks, which is a different kind of entitlement. And then another aspect was coming from your idea of this change itself, Of course, I like it because I kept on studying these changes in meaning. So all my time I'm following changes in meaning. And for instance, of course, when you talk about self, whenever you talk about it, at least the level of theory, we have to take into account that if it is constructed through habits, through often and not spoken out.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that means, but in practice, cultures become individuals by making individuals unaware that they are socially entitled and constructed. That is how it goes. It's like happening, all over time and culture. So of course, when there are movements, shifts, it is there that there is some sense of awareness that there is a construction. Because the construction, whatever it is, tends to be hidden, not to be open. Otherwise, it will be a social construction of the self. So the sense of movement in the shifts between different ways of things, or also the shifts between translations, as you were saying, that's where you can start to see things in similarities and differences. As a
think another interesting thing that came out from some of the was again an assumption that for people studying non-European culture would be immediately questioned, but often in this globalized world we tend to forget that when we talk about the self, it does not necessarily mean an individual. And I think it came out in your talk very, very clearly. And I can think of at least two different examples that I'm familiar with. I grew up in a kibbutz, and famously, people of a certain generation, when you would ask them to talk about their own individual self, they would always say we. And it was very hard for the people my mother's age to say I, even when you actively asked them to. Another example, this is not scholarly, but this is something I experienced many times.
Sorry, can I ask you to clarify that? So there's perfectly well a distinction in Hebrew between first person plural and first person singular. You can say I and we. What is the circumstance in which an I is then used?
The context of the concept.
Very often, there's actually a good documentary about that. Not just about that, but it comes up very clearly. So you would ask such a person, tell me about your childhood, which in Hebrew would be in the singular. Like, there is a distinction. It's not just you. It's, yeah, plural and singular. But you're using the singular. And then he would respond, or she would respond, we used to go out, we used to spend so much time outside, the parents were not always there, we used to do this and that. And then you would ask, yeah, but what did you like most? And we used to like most. Another example, just to, never mind the context, but of course the context matters, but we don't have time for that. But in my experience, when I talk, and I talk quite often with Palestinians in the West Bank, and they are asked to tell their own personal story. Very often, again, although there is a distinction in Arabic too, they would often fall back to the we, which is not just in grammatical or lingual terms. They would tell their personal story as a national story. And so I think, and this is another thing that I found interesting in your presentation, Maria, that I was thinking that the names were inconsequential. They were just names, but it wasn't like in our own culture that, you know, with the authorship. I mean, this whole history of making it important, who is the author, right? I mean, there's a whole history to that. Individualism, all of that is not there. It is not important, or at least I'm thinking about Ottoman Islamic context that I'm more familiar with. Very often you don't know, right, who drew this illustration. They don't sign. And they use templates, and they use the well-known patterns, and they don't try to come up and say, I innovate. Usually, of course they do, but it's not as important as to, you know, in the tradition that are more associated with the West. So, I don't know, I was talking too long, but...
No, the point about that, because I do think there's a kind of peculiarity about this particular text that I was looking at. These are individuals in a really important way, you know, so some of that, so that they have names, and then there's a literary intermediary somehow, you know, this text was compiled by some kind of literary hand, we don't know, but, and so that person is sort of, or perhaps, doing something with the names. You know, what does your name mean? Is in mind, you know, some of that But on the other hand, you have a huge body of lore that I couldn't talk about at all, the commentarial lore and the way that these women are known in other bodies of material. And
So they do try to kind of...
And they're individual people who have extremely thick particularities that the tradition is interested in preserving and elaborating. And these are particular, their narratives go to past lives, so that in the commentaries you'll have, you know, an account of she attained enlightenment in this life, we know this from this poem, but, you know, 60,000 lives back, she actually had the Buddha living at that time, and she had this complicated thing, and this has set the seeds in motion for this particular moment. So there's a huge interest in particular persons in this life.
So the idea is individuality has to be conceived of ground up. So my next one is in fact going to be called emotions of the individual. Because my argument is that the point is not the analytic notion of an individual as a particular subjective entity. It is rather how this offers many different stories than that one that comes out of the conjunction between capitalism and modern liberal democracy.
So it's not a pre-given category.
It's not a pre-given category. Everybody can understand anywhere. It's not that people don't know about their particularity. It is how do you conceive of it in terms of your narrative discourse and therefore of your sort of reflexive thinking in a philosophical.
Could I make one quick comment? It's very uninformed and impressionistic, and yet I feel this urge to make it. So, folks who grew up in the kibbutz, weren't they in the 80s and 90s suing, you know, the government, this particular kibbutz or that particular kibbutz for emotional damage for that life? I mean, you make it sound so ideal, and yet I remember growing up, you know, that this was the story, that the whole thing had broken down, and now it suddenly came to light that it was a horror show, and they were in court.
Who made it sound ideal? I did.
I mean, the way that you described, oh, we were playing outdoors. I'm not saying that you think it's ideal, of course, by no means, but this sense that that there was a completely alternative mode of existing.
I didn't say any of that. What I said was, this is how very often these people would respond to such a question. There's nothing either ideal or necessarily horrific about this, I think. For some people, it was definitely very, very difficult. For others, this was very happy childhood. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, we can talk about this over, I mean, this was my childhood to a certain extent, but no, I'm talking about the way in the kibbutz case, ideological concepts translate into a mode of upbringing, a habitus, if you wish, that seeps into their minds of the people that grow in a children's house. They rarely see their parents.
Children's house is what we call collectives. Yeah. Children didn't spend the night with their parents.
I'm just.
To go back to philosophy, and I will have the assistance of Ramad, because the second part of the 20th century in philosophy has been, in liberal philosophy at least, it has been a discussion of the positive sides of negative freedoms against positive freedom. Positive freedom, Jacobin freedom, is exactly that kind of freedom in which you assign your individual freedom because you are part of the community of children. So there is a political undertext going behind our discussion, which has driven us strongly towards the side of negative freedoms and demonizing positive freedoms. And even liberal philosophers are somehow struggling, to bring positive freedom again into the discussion, which was also part of the history of the Cold War and of the end of the Cold War. So now we are at this point with, I feel at least, we are like in the end, or somewhere in the discussion of individual freedoms and negative freedoms, but in has not the economic and social sustainability in many parts of the world. So people is trying to think, whether there are other ways of living in which the individual is not so relevant, because simply you cannot sustain it. They don't have the economy for that kind of life. We said in a very rough way, that just to say that many of the arguments we find in society are also the reflection of, as I was saying today, micro-historical trends, which are driving thinking in one direction or in another direction. It's not bad or good, it's just those patterns.
I forgot. At the risk of just a quick. Yes, no, just a thought or a comment on my personal experience throughout this day and yesterday. That I mean, the three panels were very coherent, all of them, each one of them, for me. But I mean, I was very frustrated, like moving between one panel to the other, because I mean, and then finally in the last panel, I thought, okay, so instead of like deconstructing, the process of deconstructing my own concept of the self throughout the day, I may think about it as like different kinds of anchors, completely different from one another. And I lost hope in like bridging between these anchors. But again, I thought that maybe it's not only, in referring to your question, it's not only the Western concept against the Eastern concept, against the African concept, against the collective self, social self, relation self, but maybe it's what frustrates me is like the framework of my discipline. If I'm an historian, I will think and I will frame the question about the self differently. And I'm a philosopher or anthropologist and yes, well, briefly.
I was just going to say, at the risk of being overly simplistic, might we not agree that if not the polar opposite to the narcissism of Trump, what you describe on a continuum is quite distant. If we still would want to acknowledge, I mean, we run it seems to me the danger of trying to define the self so broadly and with so many subtle nuances that it ultimately loses meaning. That's the danger that I see.
Why is that a danger? I mean, from a traditional Buddhist standpoint, that's the point, right? So that you would want to dismantle these very constructed ideas of the self, right? Without itself be liberated. So, so one of the things I was sort of interested in the conversation is that, particularly maybe the Facebook conversation, our students, like their sense of self, they understand really readily what we need when we say a highly constructed manufactured self, which is not something we create all the time. But that basic idea is very Buddhist in Upanishad too, this awareness and whole theories about how a self is formed or constructed or manufactured is a very deep series of reflections in ancient India. And so sometimes I think we tend to kind of follow this Western theory and then sort of apply it to the data of the Western world, but it's actually like India has a lot of things to say about, theoretical things to say, and fundamentally different ways of, putting this together. So this assumption that it would be a bad thing to dismiss.
No, I didn't mean it in a pejorative sense. Not at all. But I think that perhaps some of the definitions, this is just an impression that we have attached to trying to understand what is meant by the self, ultimately are so wide-ranging as to dilute any concrete definition.
But may I ask, just quickly? Sure, I'm with you 100%, but I think what's interesting here is how, if at all, these older Buddhist notions of construction different or similar? Are they just similar, or are they different? Is the Facebook culture different also? Because you referred to the similarity.
Yeah, well, I would say one difference would be that, something, I think that the modern West is very fixated on socially constructed selves, and that's most salient. But I think in a lot of the Buddhist material, they're aware of how social worlds construct us and how they know what they are. But that's not the chief point of interest, right? They're chiefly interested in previous lives, how you're constructed, how you have these deep impressions that occur, how your own emotions and your own, so everything is conditioned. So trying to name very, very complicated conditions, not just psychological, not just social, but what are the conditions of human beings experience? And it's pretty intricate how when they start naming the different kinds of conditions of human experience. You're trying to bring psychological analysis, but I think I think from a traditional those kinds of discourses within traditional Buddhist texts, this modern idea of just social construction is very simplistic.
So the point is not the similarity.
The point is the
it is the applicability. We don't kind of think, what's the similarity between a Greek atomic sense of the theory of itself and modern, media compared to, say, an Aristotelian view. What we think is, how do we deploy those thinkers to make sense of contemporary realities? That's what we're doing here. The thing is, let's not automatically assume that the terms of the discourse are already determined by us. Yes, right?
That's
what
we're doing
here. So that would be the point. What would be the case if you're trying to understand these kinds of contemporary phenomena from those kinds of theoretical perspectives? It's the availability of a multiplicity of perspectives which I think is not a challenge. It is not about incommensurability. It's not about a lack of communication. It is about a creative sense that as soon as you start claiming there is one view, it's invariably a claim to hegemony. And that's what we need to move beyond.
I'm just thinking of the movement in America these days, and I don't know if it is here in Israel too, in your email, within the university anyway, you put at the bottom of your signature what pronouns you wish to use. And because various, let's say, transsexual people want to be called they and we rather than he or she and I. And this has gotten to the level of deans and, department chairs, and at least at my university. I'm wondering, what, and people connect this to forms of oppression, that people experience, maybe Palestinians, that there's a starting point here with allowing these pronouns that is somehow connected to the oppression of Rohingya in Myanmar or Burma, or, Palestinians at checkpoints or whatever. So, this is a choice of self-defining what yourself is. I mean, how does that, I'm asking a question here, how does this you know, and this is young people very often, but not only young people. And it is not just at my university, it's quite widespread in the States, I think. So where does that go? You know,
Simply goes, is it right towards people what do they have in common, no? Isn't it? When you start to talk we or other forms, you know, which make you part of the group, it's like your mind is thinking of, it's not that.
It's a way of rejecting what they take to be a very repressive imposition of a binary gender. And so what becomes interesting is that you become not, if you're going to, in English, you don't want to be he or she, the only other available pronoun is they, which of course is the plural pronoun, but they don't mean it as a collective they just mean it as an alternative to he or she. And this has become, it's on all of our campuses, right? So often the first day of class, people go around the classroom and will identify which pronoun they want to be referred to.
I think the I, we thing is, that also is produced in history. There's a huge critique about millennials that they use I as a pronoun too much instead of we. This is part of the narcissism epidemic. It goes back to an article that is really problematic, written in the early 1980s by the same guy who made up the narcissistic personality inventory, using undergraduates and looking at their, having them talk for 5 minutes and measuring how many times they use the first person pronoun. So now it's part of our understanding that if you say I too many times, you're narcissistic. And if you use we, you're not narcissistic. It's complete and utter bullshit. It has nothing to do, it partakes of this idea that there is something behind language, that if we could only get at that thing behind language, and we will never get at what is behind language because language is all we have. So there's no way of us ever determining, is there a core self? Because the core self, and I personally don't like the language of social construction because I think everything is socially constructed, so it doesn't really tell you much. But produced in history would be another way of saying that. How would we ever know if there is such a thing as a core self when I don't know what your experience is? There is no way that we can bridge that, we can get closer to it because we use the same words or we feel there's some kind of empathy or our mirror neurons are firing, but we don't know because we are radically unknowable to each other.
Do you think that's worthwhile as a line of historical questioning? Do you think that the process of asking these questions and bringing together these different perspectives and sort of radically different worlds is useful to you as a historian in some way?
I think it is. I think that is part of that itself. That whole question is produced in history. Look, I've done a lot of work on identity, and people often talk about identity in a very anachronistic way. And I'll just say one sentence. Until about 1940, identity did not mean fully realized personhood. It meant, were you the same person yesterday as you were today? And it took Erik Erikson really to kind of endow each of us with an individualized kind of life history and a sense of sort of phenomenological self. It was not part of philosophy. It was not part of psychoanalysis. It was just not part of the way that people talked about the self until the 1940s. And so a lot of writing on identity is very problematic because it assumes a kind of more modern conceptualization of what this kind of more democratic self might be in an earlier period. So I think the questioning we're doing is incredibly important. But I think I also think the desire to have this kind of unified core self is itself produced in history. It's part of a moment. It's not that, I don't know. I'm taking a position, obviously, but I do think that the quest for kind of universal selfhood it will be frustrating.
Okay. I just want to say about the use of the term core self, that I of course didn't mean to imply that there is a core self, but when you look at this search for a core self, you see that it's pretty persistent in different times, and also here we have a notion of a fragmented self. We're willing to accept mobility and change, and there is always this, it kind of lurks there, this notion of a self that is something more than just the sum of its parts, and it's not just a flux. I mean, you can find this tendency even when you speak about the narcissistic self. There is there is still a unifying principle there, and the Buddhists would give a kind of a very simple answer to that. They would say, well, this is our most basic tendency. You know, we construct the self and a unified self, but I mean, it's kind of historians and people that are doing social history, and maybe we should count or give some attention to this persistency, and not just in the West, not just in early modernity, of this search for a self. I think it's kind of interesting, right? Why it doesn't disappear? Why can't we just do away with that and move into Facebook entirely?
Yeah, I think there are a few associations. One is taking up on one point. I think that it's always challenging in the positive and negative sense of the word challenging to bring people from different disciplines together, because we're not really using the same language. We seem to be using the same language, but we're not. And so, you know, we're listening askew. And I think this can be very productive, but I think you also have to understand that there is a degree of productive misunderstanding. And part and parcel of that would maybe one thing, which is I think we are interested in different things when we're interested in the self, depending on whether I'm coming at it as a historian, as a literary cultural scholar, as someone who's interested in, that's why I foregrounded the aesthetics in my discussion, because I wanted to emphasize I'm working with a medium which is always highly self-referential. So which self am I talking about there? The protagonist, the person who made the film, the person watching the film, a whole sum of other. So, my point here is simply to say, what is it that we're trying, or what is it you are trying to find out when you're asking about self? Because I think that it's also the question, what do I want to get out of a discussion of the self, that is key, and that I think may be different from the different things we're talking about here. Because for me, I don't have all that much to say about social media, but concepts that continue to be important to me, we use the word authenticity. Self used to be one of these knee-jerk concepts where we would say that doesn't exist, right? I mean, the subject is divided. So authenticity is another one of those concepts that used to make us very nervous, the real, the true. And then I'm always interested in asking, why does that make us nervous? Does that need to make us nervous? Can we do something with a concept like the authentic? Does that seem to be important? In some discussions we had, I'm more interested if we're thinking about selves, constructed selves, issues like, that comes from my own training in reading a philosopher like Stanley Cavell. Visibility, invisibility, what can you hear, what can you not, what is legible, what is audible. So it's not just deconstruction, you're never fully seen, heard, but rather when do we see, when do we not see? Or when Judith Butler keeps asking about grievability for whom, in relationship to what, concepts of agency, because I would be a little nervous getting rid of notions of selves completely, because I am very passionate about people being able to take things to court and say, I want to be heard, I want justice, etc., and I can only do that if in one way or another I have what we used to call subject position. I don't need to call that self, but I need to, but that's because I'm interested in something. What gets seen, what doesn't get seen, at what points does it or doesn't it get seen? Why is it important to make things visible, hearable, audible, noticeable, again, speakable, again, grievable, juridical. And again, that's a question of what it is you're interested in, from a disciplinary point of view. And it seems to me that, with your Frederick Douglass, it's the question of making him heard again and asking yourself, why was he not heard at certain moments, and what does it mean to hear him? And you're not ever hearing him, as you so beautifully showed. You were hearing multiple versions of him, which means we're also hearing the receivers that he was already bringing into play when he was conceiving of him, or what you were saying with the people who are listening to Trump. That's, so that would be my association with your question.
Well, I have to say that we never intended to get an answer. What is the self? Just we hope that the most of it would be to bring people from different disciplines to engage in open conversation about it. And I think that the fact that we are, have so many open questions is actually a success for us. It's for engaging in this conversation.
I was just going to address your question about this. You're right about the long-standing kind of desire among people for this idea of a core sense of self that's seems never to be attained. And I couldn't help but connect it to this, in a sense, another long-standing desire for hegemony. It on the one hand, it provides a sense of order. It gives an overarching sense of order, but it does so at great cost. And without this core, I mean, that's deeply can be deeply disturbing for a lot of people, but liberating for others. And so that's just thinking.
Okay.
White on stage.
Yeah, we're fading into the night, like the characters, in the films that Elizabeth showed. Okay, before we wrap up, I would really like to thank, from the bottom of my heart, Galia Levi, who just did a really extraordinary work in making this event happen, and I think we can all agree that the difference between an enjoyable conference and a non-enjoyable conference usually is in the details. So thank you very much, Galia, for facilitating this event. Thank you all for coming from near and far. It was great to bring you all together, just a lot of our favorite scholars in the same room, so it's very exciting. And thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
We still have dinner. It's not. No, it's not so much fun as sitting here for a whole day chatting. But